Let me open this so interesting and topical debate about flawed transition as a cause of rising threats in the frame of education and democracy. We have three distinguished speakers who will open the debate by 5 to 7, maybe 10 minutes of introduction. And you will see that we will cover very large territory, going from the Middle East to Afghanistan, Pakistan. And this is the reason why we wanted to have a short introduction from every one of us, knowing that we are in Prague, which was one of the examples of transition and of peaceful revolt against a regime which didn't respect its own citizens. What is the decent life about in 21st century? What is a decent society we would like to build and to promote worldwide? And what is a decent power structure or kind of culture of administration we would like to promote, knowing that the territories we will speak about are so rich and so different? Maybe the question is also what kind of lessons we can already draw from our engagement in those countries, and how to remain engaged in terms of political presence, security presence, but also in terms of education, for instance. What is the link between security and democracy, and what kind of democracy we would like to propose? Is it an unrealistic dream we speak about? All this has to be discussed and maybe not only disclosed on the large public debates, but also analyzed behind closed door. But I think that the advantage of ours today is that we can share already very many aspects of this. I would like to invite the first on my list, Amin Tarzi, who is a Middle East expert and who is focused on defense studies. The topic I would like, Amin, you share with us is what is basically the receptiveness of Middle East region as a whole to democracy, and what is your experience you would like to share with us?
Thank you very much. It's good to be here, even though my name doesn't sound. I was actually born only a kilometer away from here in Podoli, so I'm always good to come back home. Your question about the receptiveness of democracy, you mentioned the Czech Republic. I come from the United States right now. In a recent book by Henry Kissinger, last year actually, he writes in the beginning that when he talked to President Truman, after Truman had finished his term in office in 1961, and he said what was the greatest achievement of his presidency. And Truman said the fact that we managed to, and I'm paraphrasing, managed to make two enemies into two friends, bring them into the fold of international community and make them democracies. He said that is the greatest achievement of his presidency and perhaps of the United States of America. And he said it was not the victory in World War II, but the conciliation of the World War II. Obviously, Truman was talking about the case of Germany and Japan. The question now comes in, why not the same is true, and you talked about the Czechoslovakia with President Havel. We talked about, we have had President de Klerk here talking about South Africa with a very difficult past. So what is it in the Middle East? And when I say Middle East, I'm talking mainly North Africa to Iran, the Arab Middle East specifically. Why is it that democracy seems to be not moving along? For a long time in the early 2000s, there was this idea that it has to do with the Islamic religion or the Arab psyche, that the Arab psyche is not receptive. I think it's beyond that. What I will do is, instead of looking at the specific cases today, obviously in the question and answer period, I will be very, very happy to discuss that with you, is to talk a little bit more historically I think my colleagues here will go more to specific historical cases that are ongoing. I think you have to go back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. In my view, the Middle East, and I use the term very reluctantly, because the term in itself is a term that is imposed from the outside. I always ask my friends, even the Middle Easterners, in Arabic we call it Sharq al-Awsat, middle of what, east of where? Nobody, even the locals don't even question that aspect, that this is a name that has absolutely nothing to do with the region. It is an external name that was imposed on the region, but the region has accepted that. But why not the other concept from the outside? So the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, why am I going to that? Because I don't think the Middle East has recovered from that, if you would, that earthquake. If you look at the collapse of the Ottoman Empire as an earthquake, the earth is still both shaking and readjusting. This is where we are with the states in the Middle East. This is why you have people like Baghdadi, who right now heading Daesh or ISIS or ISIL, whatever you want to call it, going back to the treaties that led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and makes his case on it. So number one, in the case of Middle East, there is a unfinished business of state building and nation building. I know in Washington we kind of use these two terms, nation and state, interchangeably, but I think they're very distinct issues. In the Middle East, neither the state formation, i.e., and I'm talking here about state in a post-Westphalian and then later Germanic aspect of what the state is, which is a physical entity with specific, if you go back to Weber, specific attributes. Neither that aspect nor the more idealistic aspect of nation has gelled. And in that struggle, the Middle Eastern countries, by and large, looked at different trends to bring in an aspect of, if you would, democracy. Democracy really never took root, but democracy was either imposed from the Soviet side. Most of any country in the Arab world which had the name democratic in the olden days in the Cold War were pro-Soviet, Democratic People's Democratic of Yemen, and so on and so forth. Algeria, Libya, so on. Or they were, from the Western side, democracy was a tool. The main thing was that if you opposed the Soviet Union, it doesn't matter what kind of government you had, you were supported, whether you were a monarchy, whether you were one of these republics in Arabic, some people call them Gumlukia, which is a mixture of kingdom and republic, where basically they stayed forever. So yes, the geopolitics played a role, but they play a role everywhere. Everywhere in the world there is geopolitics. Why in this region, per se, there is no rooting of the civil society, which President Havel talked about? Democracy has to have precursors. And here I think you have to look, again, post-Ottoman to modern day. What has happened is in the space in the Middle East, both the private space and the public space is still dominated by religion. It is not the issue of religion of Islam itself. It is the fact that the religion of Islam permeates every aspect of life. Somebody yesterday said, and I agree with the speaker from Denmark, said that unless the Muslims who come to Europe accept two things, he said, one, they cannot, they have to forego this whole issue of blasphemy and apostasy. I add to that one more thing. I agree with those two, as rights of women. These are three aspects of, there are more, but these three aspects will make the society receptive to a notion where you actually give rights out, even if you are the majority. That's the notion of democracy we have been talking about. And this is what I'm glad that I'm here, is because the notion of education and democracy, because we have seen it. My country, United States, tried to force-feed democracy. It does not work like that. It has to be learned from the beginning. Unfortunately, Middle East, and I say that, in most of the countries that we look today, there's a reversal of that. Democracy, by all means of it, has actually looked very negatively, partially because of the elections that led to very unsavory situations, partially because there is no understanding of democracy, because democracy is still seen as a Western tool, which started, again, I go back to the Ottomans, that it was a way to dominate the Middle East, where the Middle East right now wants to dominate back. Middle East as a whole, or Islam if you would, wants to become the dominant religion and looks at this aspect of democracy in Middle East as a tool in the toolbox of the West, as was used during the Ottoman period, post-Ottoman, still being used to subdue them. When you have that aspect, so they have not owned it. President Havel, de Klerk, Japan, Germany after World War II, they didn't look at it as an American, German, French. They looked at it as a system of government that would allow them to move on into a different phase of existence as a nation state. That is not happening in the Middle East. And I think we need to look more theoretically at what is happening, and I don't think so. I don't want to be a pessimist, but in this case, unfortunately, having worked pretty much all my life on that subject of Middle East, mainly security, I have to say, I don't see the trend going positively right now. The civil society, the education aspects, in most of the cases, there are some cases here and there, Tunisia maybe for a while at least, but in most of these cases as we speak right now, the trend is backwards, not forward. And again, as I said, unless there's a debate among the people of the region, and a debate that they own as their own, not something that we have given it to them, I don't think you will have a democracy will not germinate. Whether you want to call it Islamic democracy, you want to call it Middle Eastern democracy, you want to call it something else. As I say, they accepted Sharq al-Awsat, or Middle East, even though it's an absolutely imperialistic notion of their own region. Still, everybody calls it. The biggest newspaper in the Middle East is called Sharq al-Awsat, which is a Saudi paper. But something that the region should accept as its own and then move beyond, and not look at it as a confrontational aspect. And I think it has to start with the public space. To be allowed to say that you are either not a Muslim, or you can change your religion, or you can talk about religion openly and not be killed, or not be threatened to be killed. And that woman is always, the debate among the Islamists, and by the word Islamist, I only mean political Islam, whether it's violent or not violent. Whoever uses the religion of Islam as a political tool, whether it's the party in power in Turkey or whether it is Daesh, doesn't matter to me. Islamism to me is not a pejorative term. It's a political term. Among the Islamists, some of the things that they actually look at themselves in their pedigree is rights of women. Until that becomes a given, you cannot move forward, in my view. So yes, blasphemy, apostasy, rights of women, these are debates that have to come from inside before we talk about some kind of a democratic values that in the West is acceptable. Even in the West right now, they're being challenged. I mean, we keep on hearing that this country or that country in Europe has a Christian value. So it's coming back. Maybe sometimes there's a step backwards here as well. But in the Middle East, I don't think we have to look at the European model or trend, but find a way within education to give the Middle East its own model of a government where the minority has a voice, where the weak, i.e. women, have a voice, where the religious minorities are not being persecuted and killed, where they are not looked down as apostates. In every single Middle Eastern country, almost everyone, there's communities that are basically living in fear just because they believe in certain something else. This doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Certain countries here and there, yes, but in a region, there's no other region. And it's not Islam because you have Indonesias of the world, you have Malaysias of the world, you have Pakistan. Well, I'll stop on that one. But you have Malaysias and Indonesias of the world where this happens. So I would leave it that, and then we can come on specifics if you want. I think I'm getting into the end of my time, and thank you very much.
I mean, thank you very much, because you highlighted already in a very short time several very topical issues for debate. You spoke about state and nation building. You spoke about ownership of democracy, not as a tool of domination, but of people who would like to take part on this process. Fear, which is omnipresent. Education, which might help to give a voice to minority in order to challenge this omnipresent dominance of one single voice, making the same of public and private space with Islam as a religion. Thank you very much. Maybe there are many issues already we might develop, but without further, I would like to invite my next speaker, Shadi Hamid, who is, among others, a specialist also of movements of Islam, within Islam, and who might maybe develop some of those issues we already opened in the specific case of Egypt. Shadi, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, good to be here. So I'm going to just say a few words about Egypt and then maybe make some broader points that are applicable to the region at large. So, I mean, it's a little bit depressing for me to talk about democracy in Egypt, and we heard the speaker in the opening plenary yesterday. I was in Tahrir Square when Mubarak fell on February 11th, 2011. And I remember the moment when the announcement was made that Mubarak was stepping down, and it was a wonderful moment. And I remember later that night, I overheard an Egyptian woman at a cafe saying, "I've never seen Egyptians so happy in my life." And I think she was right, and I had never seen Egyptians so happy in my life. So I kind of start off with that because that's where we were not that long ago. So what? Just over about 4 years ago. So, and then what we saw in the summer of 2013 is sort of the opposite or the bookend of that. And as many of you know, there was a military coup on July 3rd, 2013. The main Islamist movement in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, came to power through democratic elections. And then something worse happened on August 14th, 2013, what Human Rights Watch calls the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history. And I wasn't there for the massacre. I left actually 2 days before the massacre happened, but I was there in the lead up to it. And I don't know if others here have experienced something like this, but it's an odd thing to wait for a massacre. You know it's going to happen, you don't know quite when, but there's a kind of tension building in the country. And I was at the site of the massacre where it eventually happened. And what I saw in Egypt at that time was a kind of bloodlust where many Egyptians were cheering on the military, hoping that the military would basically commit a mass killing of their own countrymen. And I'm born and raised in the US, but originally Egyptian, and I had relatives, uncles, in Egypt who supported the mass killing, and openly and without shame. And it's interesting to me because usually when you want to kill people, you feel kind of bad about it, like I shouldn't be wanting to kill people. But here in Egypt, there was a kind of openness about it that was very striking to me. You read about this in graduate school, about how people turn against each other and have this desire to kill, but to actually see it playing out, not just with people, but with people that you love, people who are part of your family, your friends, and your colleagues. And it raises a question about the nature of evil. How do otherwise, and I think that my uncles are otherwise good people, how do otherwise good people come to support what I would consider to be evil things? I just kind of use that as an opening to kind of, you know, and these are people who were self-proclaimed Democrats, self-proclaimed liberals, so how do people turn against democracy so quickly? Egypt is a fascinating and frightening case study of how that shift can happen rather quickly. And here I would build on some of Amin's points that it's not the whole story, but it's a big part of the story, that the divides in Egypt and in much of the Middle East, it's not about power and politics in the way that we understand it in the West, where people disagree about policies. Here it was raw and existential, and it had to do with something so basic and so fundamental, which is the nature, meaning and purpose of the nation state. So that wasn't resolved. So what makes a state? Egyptians didn't agree on that. And at the center of that question is the role of religion in public life, where if you talk to a lot of secularists or liberals, they were afraid that if the democratic process continued, that the very identity of the Egyptian state would be altered beyond recognition because groups like the Muslim Brotherhood would keep on winning. They had already won 6 consecutive elections and referenda in the first 2 years of the Arab Spring. And what would happen if they kept on winning on the presidential level, the parliamentary level, the local level? What would that mean for what it meant to be Egyptian? And while I disagreed profoundly with the coup myself, I could also understand the existential tenor that you're afraid that, democracy is nice in theory, but it's Egyptians who have to live with the consequences of elections. And if it affects the way you live on a daily basis, the way you relate to your state, the way you dress, the way you eat and drink, the way it's very personal. And that's where we can begin to understand why people felt this raw existential aspect of it. And this is where I think the Egyptian case, in many cases in the Middle East, diverge from, say, the Latin American cases, where in Latin American transitions, I think we were somewhat spoiled by those transitions. The primary cleavage was not entirely, but was primarily economic in nature. So you could have socialists reassuring regime elites that their economic interests would be protected. So there was something that people could discuss, and it was quite tangible. You can split the middle on economic issues, but how do you split the middle on ideology and religion and identity? These are they're intangible, they're metaphysical, and they become very difficult to talk about. And it kind of gets us into a question that, again, Amin alluded to, which I think is very challenging, especially for us as Westerners, because I think most of us, I'm speaking here as an American, I'm a small L liberal and a small D Democrat, and I presume many Europeans are as well. But what happens when one of these values comes into conflict with the other? And from an American perspective, we think about liberalism and democracy going hand in hand, and that was our own history, that the foundations of constitutional liberalism were established, and then and only then did democracy, in the sense of universal suffrage, of full political equality for all citizens, become possible. So there was a particular kind of ordering. But what if it happens to be the case that more democracy could actually mean less liberalism? How do we feel about that? What do we value more, and if we have to make a choice? And let me just be a little bit more specific about what I'm getting at here, is that, and again, I alluded to this earlier, that what happens if Islamist movements come to power through democratic elections? And it raises a broader question, because according to most of the polling that we have, in some of the more conservative countries of the Middle East, large majorities say that they would like more mixing of religion and politics, not less, and broad support for the implementation of Sharia law. Now, people disagree about what exactly that means in practice, so Sharia isn't one thing, but even so-called liberals in a place like Egypt give lip service to the role of Sharia in public life. It's very hard to find people who would say that there should be full, total secularism where religion is privatized, because these are deeply conservative countries. So the question that I would pose to all of you is, and it's a tough one, is what if Egyptians, Jordanians, or Tunisians, or whoever decide through the democratic process that they would rather not be liberal? What do we do about that, right? And this is where this question of what we believe about gender equality or blasphemy, what if it's the case that Muslim majority populations decide they want to pass legislation that puts certain limits on blasphemy? Should they be allowed to do that? And that gets into a set of challenging questions about what the constitutional order is. But we shouldn't assume that all peoples, cultures, and societies move along this linear trajectory towards the end of history. That there may, in fact, be some societies and cultures that decide that they would like to retain a larger role for religion. But how do we find the right balance? And this is where I would close with, I don't think there's an easy resolution to what I would characterize as the Islamist secular divide in the Middle East. But there has to be a way to find a role, to accommodate a role for Islam and for Islamism within the democratic process. It's not a sustainable solution to push mainstream, nonviolent, peaceful Islamists outside of the political process. Because then essentially you're saying that 20 or 30% or whatever, that they simply are not allowed a stake in the democratic process. And that's simply not sustainable, and it's certainly not democratic.
Thank you very much, Shadi. Your points about how quickly or easily one who was proclaimed himself Democrats can turn against democracy is something very strident to imagine, because even in our own country or own region, we can speak maybe about such an experience. Furthermore, how via democratic process, non-democratic forces comes to power. Another issue which has to be debated and developed even in this part of Europe. And the very basic question of the role of religion in public life is of utmost importance if we take into consideration that you cannot make compromise if you speak about God. So how to cope with this? I think that you raise some very interesting issues we have to develop later on, but before doing so, I would like to give the floor to Thomas Rutik. Thomas, your focus was Pakistan and maybe even more Afghanistan, a territory in which you are engaged since so many years, and maybe you have some interesting lessons learned of successes and also of failures of engagement in favor of institutions and promotion of a decent life and of a form of democracy. So what is your thoughts at the beginning of this panel?
Well, thanks very much for the possibility to be here and to speak about the country, I should say, which I'm familiar with since kind of 35 years. That's mainly Afghanistan and then Pakistan only largely through an Afghan perspective. And I also want to say that I think it's around 1/3 of these 35 years I've spent in Afghanistan, a little part also in Pakistan. And I was just following Shadi and Amin what they were saying, and when I want to give a look at how that what many supposed to be a democratization process in Afghanistan after the Taliban regime was kicked out of power in 2001, you will find many of these themes kind of reverberating in what I'm telling you, how that worked. That's what I want to talk to. So what was the plan? How did it work? What came out of it? Before I also have to say that, of course, there might be even a debate whether Afghanistan is part of this al-Sharq al-Awsat of the Middle East. Afghans are, to almost everyone there, is a Muslim. It's an Islamic country, but it's not an Arabic country, which already makes a difference. Although President Bush, when he had, I think that was called the Initiative for a Democratic Broader Middle East, he also envisaged the whole area, and that was also one of the things which made it so difficult for Afghanistan, because he said we want to make Afghanistan, or we want to change Afghanistan into a democratic pivot for that whole region, so they should be a shining example of democracy. I mean, you're all reading newspapers and watching TV, very definitely has not happened, unfortunately, for the Afghans. There's a third point I wanted to make. Afghanistan is a very poor country. You even cannot compare it with a country like Egypt or other countries in the Middle East. And poverty also, of course, is such a grave problem which very often can stand in the way of democracy, because before you can start thinking about democratic values and how you want to build up democratic institutions, and so you need something to eat first. And that's still a problem for a large part of the Afghan population, which according to their own government's figures, 40% still live under the poverty line. And it's a poverty line which is defined by Afghanistan, not international standards. So that's quite much lower than what you have in most other countries. On the other hand, there was a lot of reason for optimism in 2001 when the Taliban regime was toppled in Afghanistan, which was one of the darkest regimes which we probably had worldwide. On the other hand, it also was very much demonized in our media and by many analysts also. So we also should, actually we cannot do that here in 7 minutes, but look a little bit more into the depth of why these things happened. That's my point where I want to start. I was in Afghanistan just immediately after the Taliban regime collapsed. We came back. I was working for the United Nations, and we were organizing the first so-called Loya Jirga. That's an old Afghan tribal democratic instrument to make political decisions of most profound importance by inviting kind of representatives of all political, social groups, and so on. Afghanistan at that point had went through almost 3 decades of, let's call it dictatorships. The first was in 1973. There was a one-party state, was called a republic. That's probably a good example for something which has a liberal name but doesn't work that liberally or democratically. Then there was a coup d'etat. Then you had something which was called a communist regime, at least left-wing. 2 years later, Soviet invasion, bolstering that regime, which had run into massive resistance. After 10 years, when the Soviets withdrew, the resistance fighters, the fighters for liberation, which were mainly Islamists, took over and messed up whole Afghanistan even more than what has happened before. The people had high hopes that they would come because they were their people, they had been supported by the population, and they would now start governing the country and kind of bringing it back into normal circumstances. It didn't happen, the opposite happened. It descended into a factional war. I even don't want to use the word civil war, because that would mean that the population actually was with the hearts in that fighting, but they weren't. They were mainly forced, and there were no other kind of points of reference as these Mujahideen organizations. So then this whole hope, which had been invested into the Mujahideen, faded away, and then there came a movement in southern Afghanistan emerged in southern Afghanistan, the Taliban movement, who said, okay, now you had these Mujahideen who had fought under an Islamic umbrella, but they have not really implemented real Islam in Afghanistan. You see, that was all kind of shirk, that was factionalism. Everyone fought against each other. We will now come and we'll do real Islam. We will disarm everyone, which they did with most of the other factions, and they established peace in Afghanistan under very harsh conditions. I mean, no one was allowed to oppose them politically, but also socially. I mean, women were kicked out of most of the professions, and education institutions were shut down. You know all of that, grave human rights violations, although that's what I meant when I said we also should not over-demonize the Taliban. These kind of human rights abuses have happened under the communists, under the Mujahideen, under the Taliban, and also after the Taliban, unfortunately. So it's not that the Taliban are black and everyone else in Afghanistan has been white. So 2001, after 9/11, Afghanistan was on the political international map again. Out of a sudden intervention, US-led intervention, Taliban kicked out in a couple of weeks. And you almost had something which looked like a blank sheet on which you now could draw a new system. That's what many people now say, that the intervention was something like now the Western world would implement democracy in Afghanistan. And that's the point which I find first wrong and also different from what's happening in many of the Middle Eastern countries. When I was there preparing the Loya Jirga, which happened in mid-2002, I spoke the two main Afghan languages. I'm still speaking them. And my job was to talk to delegations who came to visit those people from the UN who were sitting there with a team of Afghans to organize that transitional institution. And I had people from all provinces, from all runs of life, from tribal leaders, nomads, women, intelligentsia, and whatever. And never heard for a single time. That was after the Bonn conference in the late 2001, where the main Afghan factions decided how to rebuild Afghanistan also politically. And in that Bonn conference document was said it should be a pluralistic, democratic society and institutions also based on Islamic values, which, I mean, it's a difficult topic. But the thing is, in these 6 months, I never heard from anyone that they said, no, we don't want democracy. That's the astonishing thing. Afghanistan, and that's what people who do research on democracy say, the chances for becoming democratic is easier, or is what would you call it? You can do that easier in countries which had already democratic experience. And Afghanistan, not many people know that, already had a couple of phases over the last 100 years where they tried parliamentarism, pluralism, democracy, which was very often not very successful, not because democracy was a bad thing, but because there were still enough political forces who thought, okay, that's not working in our direction, and we just stopped that by a coup d'etat, and it always happened, I mean, from the beginning of the 20th century and so on. But the thing was now, I mean, I still hear one of my Afghan friends, I can say, telling me, said, you know, we now had communism, we had Islamism to Islamist regimes who did not work, which is very important. So now we want democracy, but what happens if democracy fails? And this is the other point which I just do very shortly, because I think probably we can come back to that in the question and answers. It was based in the Bonn Agreement on Afghan institutions. I mean, we were together with the Afghans writing that text over there, and it was based on the 1964 constitution in Afghanistan, which had parliamentarism, pluralism, even political parties and so on. So we went back to that because most of the Afghans related to that time as the most peaceful one they had experienced over many years. And as I said, it was based also on a document which has been put forward by an Afghan party, by a party which belonged to the former king, which on their own had tried in the late 90s to mediate between the civil war factions in Afghanistan, bring them together. So it was not that in Afghanistan something was tried which was kind of dropped by a parachute and say, okay, now this box is falling down, this is democracy, you open it and you just do it. That was not the idea. It was very consciously done relating to Afghan own experiences and institutions. But then how it was done was actually went very badly. And this is because the whole issue in Afghanistan very soon became militarized. I mean, the Taliban were gone, but the global war on terror was announced, and the governments who had their troops, they thought the priority is now to hunt down Al-Qaeda, whatever that was in those days. I mean, I still have never seen any convincing paper which said these were the structures of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, apart from a few people organizing 9/11, but that has nothing to do with the Taliban regime, for instance, and this kind of mixing up Al-Qaeda with the Taliban is also analytically one of the root sources for why it went so unwell afterwards. So what was done is militarization, kind of sweeping up remnants of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and then everything will be fine. But what happened was the war escalated. The Taliban were actually built up by that, also by a government which was put into place, and the warlords in an alliance with that new government, which was very corrupt, so that many people thought, actually, to put it a little bit black and white, the Taliban are the good guys because they're fighting against corruption, and more they're fighting against the foreign intervention. So what was actually a thing which was not foreign to Afghans, but built on Afghan experience, was implemented so badly that we just created more war in Afghanistan. That's now what we face in the situation there. I mean, we had more civilian people in Afghanistan killed over the last 15 years than this year. So this is just an escalation. And this is how Afghans measure the Western involvement in their own country, and that's also how they measure democracy. What I heard very often, if this is democracy, they don't say we don't want democracy. They said, if this is democracy, which is imposed on us by us, and you impose on us an alliance with warlords who have killed so many people of us, then actually we don't want it.
Thomas, thank you very much. Your long-term experience is for us like a reality check, because you recall events which are in a history so important. The moment when the democracy or a democratic process was prepared, conceived, maybe badly afterwards introduced, and your question, what happens if democracy fails, is maybe a question that is struggling many people in the region we are speaking about. Maybe, I mean, would you like to develop something that you have just heard and you would like to reflect and share with us?
Sure. What if democracy fails? Again, going back to from Afghanistan westward, I think right now, I think Shadi and Thomas both talked about two specific cases, two different, but I think two very pivotal cases in the case of, if we take Afghanistan to be this greater Middle East, on the fringes of Middle East. In one case, in case of Afghanistan, you had, as you just heard, a 64 constitution, which was Afghan-led. Yes, there was a French author in it, but it was an Afghan-led, Afghan-accepted document, which was there for about 10 years or so. And yes, there was an institution mixed with an Afghan institution, Loya Jirga, which is, means Grand Assembly in Pashto. And it was not implemented partially because of geopolitics. I think Thomas is right that Afghans have shown that democracy was what they wanted, even in the last election, which didn't go very well. They braved cutting off their fingers, they braved being shot, but they stood online. I mean, here, we just heard from the Czech Republic, for example, 20% or less vote. In my country, very few people vote in America. Very few people vote. We hear about it, but when you look at here in Afghanistan, nobody threatens you. You can vote, and we get 2 hours off even if we go vote. Yet people don't vote. So there is an interest in democracy against all odds. In case of Egypt, and I think that Shadi's question is very important. In case of Egypt, and this is a question that will come back to our countries, and here I say more about US, Germany, the bigger countries, is what if every democracy for the US, when promotion of democracy came in, it started basically from Ronald Reagan, and then you had a very big push under Bush, which we heard, the freedom agenda for the greater Middle East, and then President Obama, which was more a softer version. If you look at each one of those, the results of them, who's won these democratic elections? The very first one, you go to Hamas. The Israelis leave the Gaza Strip, give it to the Palestinians. There's an election. Fair enough. It wasn't 100% fair, but who wins? Hamas wins. And I think I agree with Shadi. If you have elections in most of the countries in the Middle East right now, the Islamists will win. So what do you do about that? Do you disallow it? So again, this is a big question. You disallow it because the results is not what you want, or you allow it, and then how you work with it. I think this is a dilemma. And here, dilemma, I say it in the Greek sense of the word. What is dilemma? Dilemma comes from the Greek tragedies. You have two choices, none of which are good. And here, in the Greek sense of the word dilemma, fits this 100% to the point. Sophocles of Euripides could have written a very good tragedy based on that, because it is a tragedy, a Greek tragedy, because you have two choices, none of which are good. Case of Afghanistan, I think, I agree with Thomas that could have been, if played well, could have been a success story for many reasons. One, it came after several wars. Two, there was incredible international attention. People like him devoted their lives to it, but there were 87 countries had representatives. troops from every country, including the Czech Republic. So there was a lot of international attention. With all that, I think we collectively, the international community, botched that one. But would have Afghanistan even, let's say it's whatever the success. Today you had a more or less a election system that worked well, and also the civil society that was flourishing. Because elections are not democracy, by the way. We always make that mistake. Hitler won by elections. So the idea is that we have to make sure that what comes out of elections is a political system that allows, again, in my view, allows dissent, allows room for the other. Afghanistan, I think still with all the damages, Afghans used to kill each other over politics. Right now, people are dying, but on the political level, there is some semblance of normalcy. Mercy is right now in jail. Whether we like him or not, he won an election. Right now, he's charged for, basically for treason. That's not happened in Afghanistan yet. So, again, it's a very little small measure, but there it is. But I go back to the fundamental questions. Cases, we can discuss them. Yemen, 5 years ago, we were looking at Yemen as the model transition. I'm not making this up. We were. We collectively looked at Yemen as a model transition. Look at it today. Is there Yemen? We don't even know what's going on in Yemen. So what is happening? I think we need to look again. That's why I started my intervention more on a theoretical, long-term basis than a short-term. I don't think there's a panacea. I don't think there's any short-term. And what happened in Afghanistan, I don't think is going to happen. Billions and billions and billions of euros and dollars, troops from the entire NATO, plus NATO, Australians and South Koreans. With all of that, it didn't work. The spoon-feeding did not work. In case of Egypt, the Egyptians took their own choice and they voted for somebody that maybe the majority of Egyptians, the liberal Egyptians, didn't even like. So what to do? I think we have to go back to the drawing board. It is not we. This is another thing. It is them, the people who live in the region. They need to go back, and they need that space from the West as well. The problem with Middle East is that Middle East sits in a place. I mean, look at it. Look at the refugees. I'm a refugee, so I have a sympathy for refugees. At the same time, I understand the problems thereof. I've been a refugee 3 times in my life, so I can understand what it is. The idea is what to do with all of these, looking at the geopolitics, looking at security aspects, and looking at this debate within Islam. There is a debate, but it's a very, very exclusive debate, not inclusive. It's a very harsh debate. It's a debate that if you're not, what you're saying is not liked by the power to be, you're condemned to death. So again, go back to this very city. How many people have been killed in this city over, if you cross your sort of like this, or you go like that? We forget history. So this is happening. I'm not saying it's parallels of what happened in Christianity between the Protestants and Catholics or so on and so forth, but there is a semblance of that happening in the Middle East. However, it's happening where there's a clash of powers. The Middle East sits right under the soft belly of Europe. There's the issue of Israel. There's the issue of internal Muslim problems, whether Shia Sunni, Iran Saudi. All of that permeates a situation which I think right now, for the short term, doesn't look very good. And where that term education comes in. The only thing that makes me more positive is that we have to look at education. Let's hope that there is a debate, internal debate, that looks at education and makes it that the people who come up, next generations, think as what Shadi said. Yes, he's right. You have to give room to the Islamists. But they have to give room for the other too, and how you balance that out. It only can come through a dialogue and education. Honestly, I don't see it right now. And I will tell you personally, if I had a choice right now, I'll go live in New Zealand. Because after 51 years of dealing with this thing, I have come to a point where I'm about to hang it up. I'm sorry I can be more positive, but you know, those of us who have spent this, I mean, I have seen more sand than other things within the sand that I have come to a point that I am not very pessimistic. And that's the reason because of it. Again, maybe I should be more positive, but I'm not.
Thank you, Amin, for sharing with us your framing, because this long-term perspective is what we need desperately today. But in short term, and you understand the topic of security more than anyone else in this room, we have also to tackle the question of insecurity. But Shadi, you wanted to react.
Yeah, sure,
so
sure.
please, the
So
floor
to your
is yours.
question of what happens when democracies fail, look, we're all in some ways losing faith in democracy, whether it's in the West or in the Arab world. But what we see time and time again is whatever happens after democracy fails is almost always worse. And that's I can't think of really any exception to that rule. So whether we look at Yemen or Iraq, these were very flawed democratic processes, but at least there was political movement, at least people had choices. Usually what the alternative is civil wars, civil conflict. And that's what we're seeing now throughout the Middle East. On the dilemma, and I think I like this kind of Greek tragedy thing because it does feel like that sometimes. So, I mean, the liberalism thing is complicated because for us as small L liberals, we feel that liberalism is the neutral system, and that's a solution to ideological conflict, that everyone's able to express their own opinions. I mean, we have that in the US where evangelicals, Orthodox Jews, conservative Muslims, they can express their problematic views through the democratic process, and that seems to work fairly well. But the problem, liberalism is only neutral if you are in fact a liberal. If you're an Islamist, you don't consider liberalism to be a neutral political system. Islamists cannot be fully Islamist in a liberal political system. And that's not to get into the kind of the political theory of it, but I want to problematize that a little bit. We do have cases of illiberal democracies that I would say are deeply flawed, but are at least better than the alternative. So for example, I would say Israel is a classic example of an illiberal democracy. Yes, we have a lot of problems with it. Yes, Arabs are second-class citizens. But there is a process there, and I would prefer that over whatever, I'm not sure what the alternative in Israel would be, but that's better than dictatorship. And we can talk about India as well. In India, we have a right-wing Hindu nationalist who, as far as we can tell, was complicit in genocidal acts against the Muslim minority, but he came to power through a democratic election. And as distasteful as that is, we have to respect that democratic outcome. And that's actually something which, in my view, was inspiring about the Indian elections, is that Muslims who felt very personally threatened by the rise of Modi, they said, look, we don't like him, we're scared of him, but he won, we have to find a way to live with that. So there's something inspiring about that. There are other examples, Hungary, Venezuela. It's not only in the Middle East where you have this tension, even though it might be more pronounced in the Middle East. And lastly, I just want to say something about, we've talked about the freedom agenda, the Bush administration, and things of that nature. Democracy has become a bad word in Washington. So we have now we prefer to use words like good governance or pluralism or inclusivity, which is maybe fine, and those are all very good things. They're not quite the same thing as democracy, but the international community does have an important role to play. And I think one of the tragedies of the last few years is that with the Arab Spring, the US and Europe had a chance to support democratic transitions and to kind of move away from our tragic history of supporting autocratic regimes throughout the region. That's what we've been doing as Americans for the last 6 decades. And we had an opportunity, and I think we missed that opportunity. And now we're back to business as usual, where we come to terms with authoritarian regimes, and we indulge them and we support them in ways that I think are very much contrary to our values, and which is why I think forums like this are so important, because as unpopular as democracy is, and I don't know, are Americans willing to really there's not a lot of Americans who are excited about democracy promotion in the region. And I'm not talking about democracy promotion in the sense of invading a foreign country. We can all agree that that was a mistake and a tragedy, but that doesn't mean that we can't put pressure on autocratic regimes to open up or to speak out or to support those people who are unjustly imprisoned. There is still space for that, and the international community should rise to the occasion, and we're not seeing much of that these days.
Thank you very much. Before we give the floor to the room, I would like also to ask Thomas, because you didn't react. Maybe there is something that inspires you in Amin's and Chadi's view you would like to develop, or maybe raise a question. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And there are actually quite a lot of things which make me think and make me want to react. First, of course, the remark, if in Washington democracy becomes a word which they don't want to hear, they're really in trouble. I mean, I go back to Afghanistan because what really troubles me there is that for many Afghans, also now democracy, which in 2001 still has something, had a ring of hope in it, now is a swear word over there. And this is, I mean, that has to do with the question which you said, what happens if non-democratic forces come into power by democratic means? In Afghanistan, it's even worse. What happens if non-democratic powers non-democratic forces come to power by non-democratic means, helped by democratic countries? And this has to do with that Washington thinks democracy is a problematic thing. I mean, listening in Germany to the not very public debate about lessons learned from Afghanistan, they do that still behind closed doors. But what I heard is that, oh, we must not talk so much about democracy anymore. We must actually relate to traditional structures much more, religion and whatever. The thing is, in Afghanistan, what usually our governments, and I know that very well from Germany, think are traditional structures are not traditional structures. That way religion, Islam in Afghanistan plays out. This whole warlordism thing. I mean, the Afghan warlords who had that big influence on the last President Karzai still have a big influence after the last elections, are Islamists, but first of all, the problem is they are armed. They don't want to share power, they don't have bought really into values of, let's call it democracy, but even in that other people should have a voice. In Afghanistan, there are a lot of people who have suffered under all these warlords for over 20 years. They have really killed scores of people. And they know when these people talk about something, they see that they have bloody hands kind of on the TV screens. But you were referring to it, because we as democratic countries did not take our values seriously by working in Afghanistan, by doing democratization on behalf of Afghans, by forcing them to do a couple of things which they did not want to do, but which would probably have created more problems, but had been a more genuine democratic process, because they would have had participation in it, in a buy-in. We have taken things out of their hands and have empowered people who are non-democratic. So that's why you have an atmosphere of fear, and not many people really dare to come out. Amin has said very rightly so that during the last elections, presidential elections last year in Afghanistan, there was that wave of hope. This is also a phenomenon in Afghanistan. Yeah. You always have a wave of hope, then it is dashed, and then the people who are already through a couple of decades of war really need to see how do we orient ourselves. But hope is coming again, hope into democracy. And in Afghanistan, the elections are held for president. It's a little bit like in France. If you don't have a winner in the first round, you go into a second round. In the first round, when you had around 10 candidates, people for the first time were looking into who are these people, what are the political programs, and for the first time they voted beyond ethnic lines, which is still a very strong kind of system of reference in Afghanistan. So it became democratic. The young, educated people came. There was no winner, and in the second round, between two people who had very strong political but also ethnic polarization, everyone was falling back into kind of defense mode again. Okay, it's better to be on my own side. That's where I get protection. That has to do also with 15 years of international engagement there, investing a lot of money and blood and whatever. But institutions are so weak that this election, I mean, in 2014, did not produce a result. We don't know how much, who...
We still don't know who won.
Yeah, we still don't know who won and with how many percent. I mean, this is really the international community has spent $1 trillion in Afghanistan if you count everything. I mean, for $1 trillion you can buy a lot of things. I thought you could also, for that money, or for that little percentage you would have needed from it to have decent election institutions and so on. You could have had an election with a percentage for a winner and a loser in the end. But the problem is no one wanted to be the loser. And that's still because the society is armed. We did not disarm them. In Bonn, there was a commitment by the international community to disarm all the civil war militias and build new armed forces for Afghanistan. Didn't happen. So you still have all these militias, officially, unofficially, hanging around with the weapons. And if there's elections, they're coming out. And they tell the people, we know where your car is parked. We know where your family is living. So think about whom you're voting for. This is not democracy. And this is something which is a result of our 15 years of intervention. Let me say one more thing, which I find very important. I think very often when we talk about religion and democracy, and we've talked about Islamists, I think it's really important, as we did it here, to talk about persons. I don't see anything in Islam which kind of for forever is against democracy. It's more about the people who do Islam, the Muslims. And as I just said, as long as you have political forces who can go back in their self-legitimization to that we are the guys who did Islam here in the country, doing the jihad against the Soviets and so on. That's what you hear in Afghanistan. And they still have arms, you will not have democracy with them. So for me, one of the key mistakes the international community did in Afghanistan immediately after 2001 was not doing this disarmament. And it was possible because all these groups were really afraid of what was happening and how strong the international community is. But we consolidated them, and we actually have built a system which in the constitution and on the surface is called democratic, but it's not. For me, it's a facade democracy. Yeah. But also, one more thing, when you said the people need to go back to the drawing board, I'm also very much in favor. I think one of the lessons learned from Afghanistan should be that we are not going there and telling them how to do it because we don't think that they're really able to do democracy. So we decide to do it instead of them. People cannot just go back to the drawing board because things which happened have happened, and you cannot, unfortunately, turn the wheel of history back. I mean, I wished we had 2001 again and can start from scratch, but that's not possible. People now have lost trust in democracy because they have seen it was something which was done by the Westerners on our behalf because they didn't trust us that we can do it ourselves. And because all of the militarization and even more trust also in institutions and in their own people was undermined. I mean, that's really that dilemma now. It's probably not only two options they had probably 4 options, but they all bad too.
Thank
also
you.
Not very optimistic, sorry.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your points. If I sum up, you spoke about hope. It is a good news. But you spoke about also facade democracy and key mistakes. If it is to leaving arms to people within a democratic procedure, this is a very topical also for Middle East, because the number of arms you see in the streets and in men's of warlords, I speak about Libya, for instance, and without touching to Syria, for instance, it is a real preoccupation. But maybe let's make a pause here, and I would like to now invite you in the audience to raise questions. Let's take 3 of you, I see, with hands, maybe 4, and we will sum up and reply to this, and if we have time, we will make a second round. So, please, the first is yours.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Pavel Pšea. I am a lecturer in international relations in Masaryk University and also the member of the board of directors of DEMAS, which is the Czech umbrella organization for NGOs working in democracy promotion. The issues that we discuss here are very comprehensive. I still try to be brief. I have partly question, partly comment, maybe mostly for Mr. Hamid, but any of the gentlemen might wish to take it up. My point is that obviously Western liberal democracy is a product of centuries of very specific cultural, political, historical, religious development, and it's difficult to be implanted upon different cultural settings. If we speak about failed transitions, be it in Egypt, be it Iraq, be it other countries in the region, then maybe it would be a good idea to ask, transitions to what? What should have been the final destination? Personally, I know strong doubts that the final destination should be democracy that is liberal democracy as we know it. I might be wrong, and they'll tell me if this is the case. But in Egypt and the other countries, there were voices arguing that this change that is going to happen, replacement of Mubarak and so on, is a change for democracy. But when you ask what that means, then the response typically is, well, that means that we want to have better living standards, we want to have more personal security, less state harassment. These are goods democracy can deliver, but basically it's not the substance of democracy. So my question basically is, so what was this final destination, and how do you see this role of democracy?
Thank you very much. Maybe the second question in the first row, please.
Well, I don't know if I have a question. I have a question comment. Being born in the United States, I feel a lot of discontent in the ranks. I don't even know what democracy is, except if I was going to redefine it for someone, I would say death from above. And I think that being a materialist culture, we've made a serious mistake in trying to understand how we impose transformations of consciousness on other people. For instance, and I'll be brief, there are at least 4 levels of consciousness that I understand, and I won't define them to a greater degree. But there's archaic, there's magical, there's mythical, which is group consciousness, and then there is mental, which is kind of perspectival space-time continuum. All seem to be moving towards another level of consciousness, which is called integral, where they all work together. It doesn't mean that any one of these levels of consciousness takes priority, but they all work together. And so when we bring a system forcibly on other people, we have to understand that whatever it is they're thinking, they're going to take the effect of what it is we're introducing, and it's going to bring about a transformation of consciousness. You know, you're not conquering people. The South, where I was raised in the United States, the war is still going on, right? And that was death from the North. People say, but you lost. And I say to them, I'm sorry, it's very, very difficult to suppress a person's desire to be free.
Thank you very much. Third question, second row.
Edward Ultratta, retired civil servant. I would want to come back to what Mr. Hamid said at the very beginning, that how he was surprised that the enthusiasm in the Tahrir Square sort of ended up in the way it did. We've had that in history many times. I mean, the situation in which democracy abolished itself has been repetitively happening after revolutions. For the classical instance, of course, is the early 1930s in Germany, but there are many other instances. Now, I feel that particularly, and here I'd like the opinion of the panel, because you have much more experience. I believe there's particular problem in the Arab Spring in that there isn't a middle class, or maybe that's too strict. There's a big difference between the feelings of the cities and the vast population of whom the cities don't really know much or don't take into account their opinions. Actually, this was the problem, I think, of the Ottoman Empire. And I would say that Turkey, for quite a while, was finding a way of, over generations, not right away, bringing the people up. And now we'll see whether it really worked, because there are some signs that maybe not as marvelously as one would have thought. There's another instance which is very interesting, but only at the beginning, and that is the new Iranian one, where it seems that they first of all managed to keep their own advice or their own judgment, and are inching their way to somewhere where there's at least some plurality of some sort. And again, we'll see where it lands. So I was going to ask if you could bring these examples into the picture somehow, and if there's anything we could do there. I would add one more thing. We ended up at the end discussing what our position should be, or basically what advice we should be giving at this moment. Now, that's exactly wrong. I mean, the fact that we were stepping in, by we I now mean Western culture, we were stepping in, has landed the area in the present mess in a way. We should step back somehow. How to do it, I don't know, because Humpty Dumpty has fallen off the wall, hasn't he? But
thank you very much. Maybe last question. I saw hands. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Michal. I'm a debate coach here in Prague, and my question is, what would an unflawed transition look like? So would Jordan or Morocco or countries like that, who are like gradually liberalizing, or at least they claim to do so, is that a successful example, or does that just take too long? Now I presume that like liberal democracy with full human rights and civic rights is like the final end game. Let's presume that that's what we are after for like all the world. So is Jordan and Morocco a way to go, or is it just is it a dead end? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, may I turn to you first? Make your choice. Jordan, Morocco transition, or Iran, Turkey, we didn't mention, or what democracy is really, or transition to what?
Okay, thank you. I would say a word or two about your transition to what, which I think is fundamental. It is not to a liberal democracy. I think that the space is very not ready for that, and it could be something within. The question here is that it goes back to my initial question, which kind of connects to yours, sir, is I don't think the Middle East, the concept of nation state is yet set. And we have not discussed ISIS. I think beyond all the trouble that we have with ISIS, the atrocities, the refugees, the destruction of a country. Again, I make it personal. My grandmother is from Syria, from Aleppo, a city that once existed. So when you look at those things, it is, ISIS is doing something very fundamentally different as well. They are changing the very concept of nation state that we in Europe have lived by. Everything we do, and I mean Western ideas, which we subconsciously, we look at it through the nation-state model. We look at it as almost biblical, that it is given, if you believe in the Bible, if not, natural processes. Well, that is going right on its head. ISIS is doing something that, the fact that they call themselves, both in Arabic and in English, the state, rather than a khilafah or a caliphate, they have a notion, they have an absolute notion what they're trying to do. They're trying to undo, sir, what you said is that post-Ottoman, which they believed was an artificial making up of this map. And we are not looking at that aspect. We are looking at the effect, not at the cause. So transition to what? First, we have to understand what is going on in this, as I said, the earthquake, post-earthquake trembling of the land, and then set to transition to what? We haven't even recognized that because we look at it in a very short term. All of our countries, those who are involved there or those who are receiving, all of you are now involved. Whether you're politically involved or not, you have become involved by your proximity to that part of the world. You cannot ignore it. You cannot barbed wire yourself. It will change the way you live. If nothing else, consciously it will. And until we look at that aspect, and see, we look at it short term. We look at it election cycles. And my country is 2 years now. It's not even 4 anymore. And every country looks at it in a much shorter, whereas the concept of time is very different in the area we call Middle East. It's a much slower process. And I don't think Baghdadi thinks that he will become the caliph of Muslims. He is an agitator at best. So he's doing his thing without the concept of time. Whereas we, politically, just this way our systems are, we look at it, how it affects ourselves in this short term, militarily, politically, economically. So I think there's almost parallel concepts going at each other, but they never meet. So that's one thing. So I don't know where to. I can't answer that to you. As far as the question of Turkey, Iran, I just came back from, actually I came to Prague from Turkey. I go to Turkey at least 4 times a year. I work at Turkey because Turkey is a very interesting model. It is a Islamist government, AKP, the AK Party, is a Islamist government which has won elections over and over again. They're losing a little bit right now, but what is happening in Turkey, that there's a civil society in Turkey. While it's being pushed down right now, they have more people in jail, journalists in Turkey than any country, but there's still the civil society is pushing itself out. Unfortunately, right now, Turkey is going through a very bad period as we speak because of 2 things, is this whole notion of nationalism against the Kurds, which comes out because of electoral concepts. And I don't have time to details. I'll tell you why what's happening today in Turkey is happening. It also damages the war against ISIL, if you would, because they have an internal issue for Turkey right now. The biggest threat is not ISIL. The biggest threat is the Kurds, period. Unless you understand that, you won't understand Turkey. You know, we at the West look at the Kobani people, these beautiful women shooting at ISIL, we like them. Turks don't like that because they have had a war for 15 years in which a lot of Turks have died. So they look at the Kurdish aspirations as a threat to their very nation state, as a irredentist claim. But Turkey has a democratic, and I think the important thing is that Turkey also, and I think you put a point on something about the center to periphery. In case of Afghanistan, the divide between Kabul, Herat, Kandahar, the main cities in the periphery, is very wide. In Turkey, that is actually becoming less and less. Still, Istanbul is so different than if you go to Eastern Turkey. I actually have a house in Western Turkey. It's 2 different countries. So Iran is again, look, Iran is not a democracy. And we talk about this whole aspect of democratization. I didn't want to bring out this whole Iran thing. We are all praising the Iran deal, which I think is good because it stopped them getting nuclear fuel. That's about it. Good agreement on that. Right now, many European countries, if we were allowed, we would do it too, are running at the highest level to get deals from Iranians. All of them. Presidents, vice presidents, whatever. Iran, if you talk about human rights, there are very few countries in that part of the world that have a worse human rights record. You talk about religious minorities, you talk about women, you talk about stoning, you talk about, they do all of that. And we, if you talk about collective responsibility, did not raise one issue about that. Not only that, within the signing of this agreement, we just ran to make deals with them. That's not promoting democracy. And this goes back to it. It is promoting short-sighted ideas. I think I will leave time for them. I'm not going to discuss Jordan and Morocco because I think the rest of the panel will discuss that.
Shadi.
Yeah, sure. Let me just ask you, are you asking what should the final destination be, or what was the final destination? What is, there's different ways of looking. What was it? Okay. So I think you pointed at a, sorry? Yeah, in reality, yeah. So you pointed to, I think, a problem with the word democracy. So everyone says they support democracy, but then when you ask them, like, what does democracy really mean to you, some people might actually say, well, it's about getting a job or social justice or the police not harassing us. Democracy has become, to the extent that people still think it's a good thing, and many people still do in theory, it's a stand-in for anything they think is good, which makes it difficult to really get precision when we're talking about this term. On some of the other issues, so the middle class, or the middle class, upper middle class, I would be, in the cities, I would be just a little bit cautious about looking at education and the development of a middle class as being some kind of panacea for the Middle East. I know this forum is called Democracy and Education, but what you find in a country like Egypt, and this is some of the best educated Egyptians are the most anti-democratic. That there does seem to be a trend there. I don't think it's a mistake. And the middle class is not a force for democracy in Egypt. The middle class, I would say, is a force for militarism and resurgent authoritarianism. The cities are actually the focal points of pro-coup activity. I mean, the places that were most supportive of the military coup were Cairo and Alexandria, the two major urban centers in the country. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. Thailand is another interesting case where the middle class and upper middle class have been the bedrocks of authoritarianism, and that have really kind of fueled what have really been a succession of coups over the last 15 years. So the middle class can be good, but it's not always good, and then it's good and bad in different ways. So I'll just kind of put that out there. When we talk about stepping back in the U.S. role, I think the Bush administration demonstrates the dangers of intervention. The Obama administration demonstrates the dangers of non-intervention. And I would hope that there can be some kind of middle ground between these two extremes. We have tried to step back. The Obama administration has tried to disengage from the Middle East. And now we can judge 6 years later whether that's been a positive example. I think Syria is a case where stepping back hasn't worked out very well, and Syrians have been begging for the U.S. and the international community to do more to protect civilians. The Syrian opposition has been demanding no-fly zones really since early 2012. So there's different ways of looking at this question of, is U.S. intervention good or bad? And I would, again, there should be a middle ground. And lastly, on this issue of, well, I think someone made the point that transitions by definition are flawed. I think it's a very worthwhile point. And there's actually a whole academic literature about how young democratizing countries tend to be the most unstable. So it's kind of like a bell curve sort of thing. But to get to a point where democracy is stable, you have to go through a period of instability, and there has to be a tolerance for that. That these countries have to work these things out, and that takes time. And this is where the Turkish case is interesting, because during electoral cycles, nationalism can actually increase. Religious sentiment can increase. There was actually a study, which I can't recall exactly the details of it, but it's an interesting one, where the argument was that anti-Muslim communal riots in India are more likely to happen before elections. We can talk about the European case. Anti-Muslim sentiment shoots up during campaign season, because unfortunately, nationalism, ideology, a lot of these bad things that we don't like are actually good ways of getting votes. And right-wing parties have done better in recent years in Europe than they had done prior. So I mean, that's an interesting kind of you know.
Thank you very much, Thomas. What is the comment or question you would like to react to?
Yeah, there are 2 points. One is that notion of time and history. When I've been a foreign news editor for many years, so I also dealt with countries outside of Afghanistan. And when I hear examples like Morocco and Jordan, I would actually answer, although that's probably not very nice to say, ask me that same question in 30 years. I mean, and I'm saying that because when I listen to examples which are proposed from the audience or hear from the podium, Turkey, we are talking about still what repercussions the breakup of the Ottoman Empire had. Or when you go to Iran, where we know that the notion of how people in Iran think about the West is still very much dominated by the coup against Mossadegh. I can go through the countries if you want. For me, one conclusion is every country, and that's very simplistic or simple in a way, every country is different, and we need to look where it comes from, what are the determined factors, and they're so different that I don't think that we will have a blueprint that transitions need to be done like this and not like that and that. It can be even quite opposite how you have to tackle certain factors in different countries. And that brings me to that second point, which I find important, is what are we supposed to do? What should we do, or how should we think about it? And this is a lesson which I think I've alluded to, which I learned in Afghanistan, is that when situations emerge where a decision is taken to intervene under certain circumstances, and probably not very much stronger incentives for an intervention like events like 9/11, still we have the opportunity to help, but the best way to help those people to determine themselves where they come from, where they want to go, is to take that famous one step back and let them decide. But the role which we could have, and which we actually should have had in Afghanistan, was setting a framework of security in which Afghans from all walks of life, powerful, not powerful, could sit together in an institution which is so well designed in Afghan society, like a Loya Jirga, which is kind of 1,500 people coming together from a country of probably 30 million. That's quite a high rate of representation from my point of view, at least. But then not go and tell them what to do. And that's exactly what we've done in the beginning, in that very crucial golden hours after an intervention. We have intervened, have said, go and vote for Karzai. I mean, there was an American ambassador who in the middle of 2002 went into a press conference and said the former Afghan king who had just returned to the country and had said, I don't want to be the king again, but I might be a candidate for head of state as a normal citizen. So the American ambassador said the king is not the candidate. The king didn't know about it. And in that Loya Jirga, I mean, I've seen the list myself. The king already had signatures from representatives who had been elected to the Loya Jirga. And then the American embassy said, you can't have that. This is definitely one step too far, if not 10 steps too far. So we are the rich countries, US, Czech Republic, Germany, we have a role to play in that world. There is no non-intervention. Even non-intervention is intervention, as we see in Syria. So we have to find the balance, what Shadi is alluding to. But we have to give the right and also the duty of decision-making to those people who live in those countries. And it's not up to us. We have messed up to many things. And that's probably the best advice we should give to ourselves. Yeah. Education. Education also can be a difficult issue. We see that in Afghanistan. That also has to do with the kind of intervention, how it has been playing out. this short-term thinking is that governments go to countries and then they want to see their flag over certain nice projects, and education is always nice to do. So Afghanistan has 34 provinces now. I think they have 22 or 24 universities in each province. I mean, if you go to some of the provinces in Afghanistan, it's really, really, really backward. I mean, if you go to that university, I've seen some from inside and also unprepared, you know, usually delegations go there and they get the best students and they prepare the questions and whatever. It's worse than the primary school than in the Czech Republic, I tell you. And now they are creating that, by these programs which we impose of them, they're creating what is called a youth bulge and an educated youth bulge. There are people who come now from the University of X, Y, or Z somewhere in the boondocks in Afghanistan, excuse my language, and they expect that they get a job and can run that country now. And when they come from these universities, they're barely able to formulate their own thought, because Afghanistan has still that frontal education system, where even at universities, texts are read to them, which they take down as, they call it dictate, as a dictate, and then they just learn it by heart and do that in the examination. And then they come and want a job, and very often they get a job in government. They're not able to answer even the most basic question. And this is because our governments very often thought, oh, why not have a German flag about university X, Y, or Z? And that also, again, and I'm finishing with this, brings me back to history. We had that in Afghanistan. We had reforms early 20th century, which increased an educated class, and the government, the state, how it worked, did not grow along with this educated class, so the people were outside. So you educate people, but you don't give them jobs. So to put it in one sense, we need, I mean, if we do something, we need integrated systems. You cannot just educate people, you also need to give them a job, because that creates, and that's a very important word which you said in your first introduction, life, I mean, a decent living, and that's what it is about. I mean, you need to improve, I mean, if you intervene, you need to improve livelihoods on one hand, but you also need to end wars, because this is what destroys very often what has been built with a lot of investment.
Let me just wrap up it in 3 points. Decent lives and decent living conditions based only on keywords and marketing of education doesn't make sense. We have to promote something more. And education only is not enough. We have to come to the roots of the culture and the society and understand what kind of possibilities they have and potentials we could develop. Second, as long as we speak about religion only in a hidden way, and we cannot talk about freely, openly, without being killed, without seeing a clear respect of women and of non-believers, or without this freedom of changing religion, as far we cannot speak about a liberal society that could be compatible with our Western way of living. And this is particularly sensitive if we speak about in this context of migrations. And third, thank you very much for bringing so many concrete examples from different territories, because we see how cautious we have to be. We have to invest in long term, because short term, before next elections, doesn't solve the issue and doesn't give us the frame and the space enough to judge and to evaluate. And we are here also to share not only the best practices, but also to draw some lessons learned, and I think that we didn't miss the occasion. So please join me in thanking our 3 prestigious panelists, because we did something that makes sense in terms of democracy and education. Thank you.